Good evening. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm Chae Young-jun, a Deputy Minister for Unification Policy at the Ministry of Unification. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you for joining us at the ROK-US North Korea experts discussion. I would like to thank our moderator Kim Jun-hyung, Chancellor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and our discussants, Ambassador Robert Galuzzi, Vice Minister Chun Hae-sung, Deputy Special Representative Alex Wong, and Policy Advisor Kim Sang-gi for their presence today. To all our online participants as well, I extend my warmest welcome and appreciation. Thank you very much. As you are very well aware, last year, the unanticipated spread of COVID-19 brought about significant changes to the international political landscape. And to much regret, the relations between the two Koreas, as well as between the U.S. and North Korea, have been in a state of lull since the US-DPRK summit in Hanoi. Against that backdrop, now the Biden administration, which expressed its commitment to respect the positions of its allies on a number of occasions, deployed at the front line foreign affairs and security experts who are very knowledgeable of the Korean Peninsula issues and is now conducting a review of its North Korea policy, including all available options. As for North Korea, at its 8th Party Congress recently, the regime did not express any concrete position on South Korea and the United States, and rather took on a reserved wait-and-see attitude. Therefore, the U.S. government's new policy towards North Korea and subsequent reactions by the North are likely to reshape the developments on the Korean Peninsula. So it is a critical juncture with possibilities in changes on the Korean Peninsula. We have invited experts who have worked under the former Clinton administration all the way to the most recent Trump administration with much experiences in ROK-US North Korea nuclear negotiations, as well as the Korean Peninsula issues, in order to evaluate nuclear negotiations between the U.S. and DPRK and also identify lessons and implications for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula going forward. And this experts' discussion will prove to be immensely meaningful in that regard. I ask our experts to work together towards denuclearization and peace building on the Korean Peninsula by pooling their wisdom and insights for a new path ahead. In closing, I wish every one of you a very good health and happiness. Thank you very much.
I want to add just one thing. I just missed the chance to say hello to Mr. Alex Wang.
Very good to see you, Mr. Minister.
Okay. Me too.
Thank you, Minister. I think I'm the one, who should take over this. Yes, my name is Kim Jun-hyung. I'm a Chancellor of KNDA. If I may, I introduce myself a little bit before I start. Can you hear me right? All right. Okay. Actually, I'm 21-year college professor before I came here, and it's been 1.5 years to be a government official, and I'm more than ready to go back to school soon. So I am characterized as a Corona chancellor or something, because I've been doing nothing out of country, but it was a good time. And especially really good to my friends and colleagues, especially Ambassador Galuzzi and Mr. Wong. I'm very honored to be a moderator of very important, with high expectations. Today's title is the evaluation of past U.S.-North Korean negotiations and prospect for Biden administration's policy toward North Korea. We have a great lineup of experts. Let me introduce briefly. Mr. Wong, and everybody knows he's the guy behind the Singapore talk, and then one of the best experts in Trump administration. He's now a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, former deputy secretary for regional and security affairs in the State Department's East Asian Bureau, and former foreign policy advisor and general counsel to Senator Tom Cotton. And Ambassador Galuzzi He's too famous. We don't need to introduce you, but he's a distinguished professor of diplomacy at Georgetown University and former chairman of the US-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and former ambassador at large and special envoy for the US Department of State. He is known to go-to guy for the US-North Korean negotiations. He's a little bit critical, but very insightful. And Chun Hae-sung, a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University and former vice minister of Unification Korea. And as you know, he is a member of Special Envoy to North Korea at 5. And he was actually involved in the Korea peace process as in good old days, but not too long ago, in 2018 and 2019. And last but not least, Dr. Kim Sang-gi. He's one of the best North Korean specialists in Korea. He's a former policy advisor for the Unification Minister in Korea. And then, yeah, we are going to have a round of presentations, 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist. And they're going to talk about the evaluation of past US government and the negotiations process and prospect for Biden administration's policy toward North Korea. And this is really timely because I heard, so many channels between the US and South Korean government through like calls and this untapped computer meeting, internet meeting, and things like that. And Minister Blinken and the Minister of Defense and coming next week. So a lot is pending. And a few days ago, Reuters reported that the review process of North Korean policy and Biden administration is not going to, take a long time, and it's sooner or later it will come out. So this is the really timely sessions. So I stop here and then give them the floor, Mr. Wong, and why don't you? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jun Hung, for that introduction, and thank you, Deputy Minister, for your opening remarks. I know the topic of this panel is about looking backward to draw lessons as we look forward. But let me start my remarks by the forward-looking part, looking at what the Biden administration may do, and what I think it would be well advised to think about as it formulates its policy and approach on North Korea. As I think we are all aware, they are amidst a policy review, a formal policy review of the North Korea policy. It is not yet complete. They are likely drafting many memos, having many meetings, and having the experts, the number of very good experts we have throughout the U.S. government discussing this now and in the next few weeks. But there are two things I think that are clear about the policy so far, and I'd like to comment on them. First is the Biden administration has made very clear that this North Korea policy, as well as all of its other policies, at least in the Indo-Pacific, but this North Korea policy is going to start with its allies. And I think the best sign of that is the trip occurring next week. Secretary Blinken arriving in Seoul as well as in Tokyo, where this will be a topic of discussion. So I think that's very good. I think it's a good sign that this is the first trip he's making. But it is important that relationship and that two-way communication and frequent and in-depth communication occur, not just at Secretary Blinken's level, at the minister level, or even at the leader level, but at the working level, meaning at the special representative level, the deputy special representative level, and other of the technical experts. And this was something I felt was very key to our policy when I was in government, the extensive exchange of views, coordination on the whole range of North Korea matters and strategies and occurrences. So I do hope that continues, and I hope it bleeds down from the leader level all the way down to the working level. So that's number one. Number two, what we also know about the policy from Secretary Blinken's confirmation hearing, I believe, he was careful not to outline all the details. He wanted to leave room for the policy review. But he did mention about the use of pressure, about the use of perhaps new elements of pressure in reviewing that policy. What I want to say about that is that I don't think that's wrong. I think that's very right. But one principle that I think they should keep in mind as they develop a new policy is that pressure in of itself is not sustainable or sufficient to reach and achieve any kind of progress on North Korea. Pressure has to be paired with an openness to diplomacy. And I say that for a few reasons. Number one, if we have pressure, meaning we try to get the world in consensus and implementing and enforcing the UN sanctions and other sanctions and pressure elements, we need to give them a reason for that, meaning it is for the purpose of achieving a peaceful, diplomatic, negotiated solution. Without that, it would be very hard in the medium and long term, and perhaps even in the short term, of keeping that pressure on North Korea. So, I mean, to put it perhaps succinctly, pressure without openness to diplomacy is not sustainable. It will fray. But diplomacy also, on the other hand, without pressure, or the openness to diplomacy and negotiation without pressure, will be fruitless. They have to go hand in hand. And that is something that I think the Biden team, as they develop their policy, should contemplate, should keep in mind as a principle going forward. I want to turn now to maybe looking a little bit back. There's a lot that happened in my time on the North Korea file, a lot that happened during the Trump administration, and we could talk about that in the upcoming session. But I want to kind of just say something broadly. There's obviously all policies are up for debate. All the results are up for debate. But one thing I will say about our approach in the Trump administration was what we succeeded in doing was together with South Korea and our allies, what we succeeded in doing was getting movement on the North Korea issue within North Korea. And what do I mean by that? If we look at what has happened and the moves of Kim Jong-un over the past 2 years, he has entered into summit diplomacy. He's entered not just a summit diplomacy with the United States, but with other nations. He's drawn back from that diplomacy. He's announced economic strategies. He's announced revisions to the economic strategy. He has reshuffled his ministry perhaps twice in that time period. The regime has issued certain threats or hinted at certain provocations, but then pulled back. What we're seeing in this 2-year period or 3-year period since the diplomacy, really 4 years, is movement, churn, rethinking, contemplation of new efforts, perhaps some stress within North Korea. That's movement within the regime, movement in the discussion within North Korea on what they should do with their nuclear program, what they should do with the outside world. And that's a good thing. Now, we didn't come to the resolution that we wanted to, but I think the movement in itself is valuable. It opens up pathways to get new information into North Korea, for them to contemplate new strategic realities, and it gets new ideas and new possibilities into the decision-making process of North Korea. Movement is important. Without movement inside North Korea, the only movement we're really going to have is their steady movement towards the expansion of their nuclear program, of their weapons of mass destruction program. So that's something to keep in mind. I think an overall lesson and a key to recognize of what occurred during the Trump period, and I hope it provides some guidance, or at least a principle, as we all together move forward on this policy set. I will stop there, and looking forward to hearing the remarks of my co-panelists.
Always forget that I have to turn on my mic. Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. Actually, yeah, I agree with the part that you talked about. Pressure and diplomacy should be combined and hand in hand. I think it's really important. But it's sometimes, some governments more emphasize the pressure. Some like pressure itself can be almost like objective of the policy. But I believe at least Biden administration think is a pressure, even though they're thinking of the raising, lifting. I mean, the increasing pressure is a effective instrument to draw North Korea to the table. So I think this is very important. And then the second part I want to talk about is, you're always together with the South Korea. That is important. But let me ask later if I have a chance that, some people in Trump government actually, I call it, they wasted time sometimes to doubt South Korean government, that South Korean might go too way forward and to kind of give them wrong signal to North Korea. They can have like a lift of sanction, things like that. So I want to ask the questions later on. Thank you very much. It's a great opening up. And next, Ambassador Galut, you're on. Yeah, same as me. You have to turn on the mic.
Is that better by any chance? Okay, so thank you to the Ministry of Unification, to the hosts for including me with the distinguished panel. I'm grateful to be here with you this evening, for me this evening. We were, as I was indicating before, encouraged to talk about the past. And my own feeling here is I really think we should focus on the past for a limited period of time to see what we might learn about what worked and what didn't work, so that if we're going to make mistakes, let's make new ones, not old ones. So I'm comfortable with that. But what I want to do this evening is talk about how we should begin our body posture, in a sense, with the North Koreans. So I'm going to be very practical here. Forgive me for that, not very theoretical. The first thing that's on my mind, because I'm at a university now, but I spent more than 20 years in government service, and I think about who is actually going to meet with whom. And my prayer here, I will share with you, is that we can recognize, as Alex said, the benefits of this meeting at the summit, of the heads of state meeting. But those of us who are familiar with a more traditional approach, I think, want to go back to that, and I do. I want to start with, I would call them senior working level meetings. And that's an important concept. Now, the Trump administration would focus a lot on the fact that the chairman met with the president, but Steve Biegun was out there, laboring as well, and Alex and other people. And I want to see more of that before heads of state meet. I want to see people who are at the assistant secretary to undersecretary level. If they're special envoys, which they may be, they should be full-time. I'm speaking about Americans now. I'm not advising the DPRK. I'm talking about the American approach to this. And I like the Clinton model of subcontracting in a policy issue. You may recall that Dennis Ross was Mr. Middle East, that we had another great ambassador who was doing the Bosnia thing, and on North Korea, one person. I had the opportunity to both manage the interagency process, instructions for a team, manage briefings of the press, our public face, and the Congress, how we presented to the Congress and the American people, and then to do the negotiation and head the team. I would like that model to be recreated as the U.S. hopefully goes into discussions with the North Koreans. I'm not prejudiced about the model here, the modality, whether it's two-party talks or three-party talks or more. But at the end of the day, the progress we want on denuclearization is going to involve a US-DPRK engagement. I don't think there's any way around that. There's no substitute for that engagement. But I'm saying here, my first point is let's get senior working discussions going, and let's don't leap to a summit. The second is, and this is maybe my most important point, and I've given it a lot of thought, and that is the objective of the meetings. If we could gain agreement with the North Koreans that our objective is the normalization of relations between the DPRK and the USA, that's the goal. It's a shared goal. I've come to the view that we have, in a sense, and myself included, made a mistake. Made a mistake when we said, okay, the North gets normalization, we get denuclearization. Wrong. We, the North, the South, the United States, Northeast Asia, gets normal relations between the DPRK, the international community, including the USA. That means that inter alia, you get the complete verified denuclearization of North Korea. North Korea returns to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. All sanctions are lifted. A treaty of peace ending the Korean War is negotiated. There's a demilitarization of the DMZ, and appropriate confidence and security building measures are put in place in a structure of relations in which there are full economic, political, and diplomatic relations. That's something we should not have as a reward for the North. We want that. The South wants that. That move is the most material move to reunification that I can imagine. And I would like to see that become our objective as well as the North objectives, and to announce that's what we're going to work through together. Third, I think we need the North to recognize with us that to get to this outcome will mean a negotiating process that's going to take time. It'll be characterized however you want to title it. It'll be characterized by reciprocal steps that may well be executed together and grouped into phases over a period of time. What's really important, please, is to understand that you can't accomplish, if you agree on that goal, you can't accomplish it by meeting for lunch. I mean, the whole idea, as I watched heads of state meet for lunch to do the deal, struck me as insane. I was at it for about 1.5 years with the North Koreans. There are an awful lot of lunches there, right? There never was a meeting of heads of state, and we got an agreement. So I think we need to have a concept of longevity here. People staying with their heads in the game for a serious amount of time. We need, if that's going to happen, to get agreement with the North from the beginning that both sides are going to exercise restraint. They're going to avoid provocations. The North will have to avoid extended range ballistic missile tests or engine tests, any nuclear weapons tests. The US and the ROK will have to avoid any large-scale combined field exercises, and the US will further have to avoid any provocative flights of military aircraft or of naval activity. We have to understand that we have to both commit to preserving the political atmosphere that makes this plausible to sustain over a period of time. I believe that this will be a credible process that populations, whether it's in the North, the South, or the US, will be patient through if there is some early substantive success. In other words, not, forgive me, there's nothing wrong with the Singapore Declaration, but we don't need more declarations. We need some substantive steps that will be identified like that. In other words, some substantive sanctions relief that the North would credit. And on our side, some substantive denuclearization that our technical people will credit. I can go into some details on what that looks like, but I'd rather not at this point. What I'm saying is some substance to lead with for good faith, and mostly for political support. I like to think, as Alex was saying, that we are off on the right foot in terms of our consultations with allies. The idea that we're starting in Seoul and Tokyo is a great move in my view. And after years of doing this a long time ago, I am convinced that they pay dividends. Every time you enter a consultation, you get benefit from it. I think I will also make the point here that early on, we're going to have to figure out what role we want for Beijing in light of if we say, the other fish we have to fry with China. There's a lot going on there. I don't know where the China review policy is, but I'll bet there's one going on. And we have to figure out where North Korea fits in there. And we need a third stop, in other words. After Seoul and Tokyo, we need to stop in Beijing, but we better know what our talking points are before we go there. I also want to warn, if I can be so bold, against either the idealistic or the super realist approach here. The super realist approach, you may have heard, it's very popular in Washington now. The super realist approach is, look, we've been at this 30 years. They're not going to denuclearize. They're never going to give up their nuclear weapons. Forget about that, right? For me, that's very presumptuous. I actually don't know what the North Korean grand strategy is. I didn't know what it was with the grandfather, the father, or now the grandson. All I know is we have to test it. And the objective, the interests of the region in that objective remain. I'm not ready to throw it over. The idealist approach, as opposed to the super realist, is I know how we do a denuclearization. We get the other side to declare everything they have and where it's located right from the beginning. Look, I did it years of denuclearization in Iraq after the first Gulf War. I know what the declarations are worth. I understand the conceptual virtue of having a baseline. But my advice is forget it. Right? Do not insist on that. Do not make that a sine qua non for the further progress. You'll get there. Make this part of the process. Finally, I think it's extremely important for peace in Northeast Asia that the body posture, the place I started my comments, for the United States, it's got three essential parts. First, absolute confidence in our alliances, actually, and of the value and credibility of the extended deterrent. There should be no ambiguity in deterrence or in assurance of allies. Second, here, specifically on deterrence, I don't have any problem with a recognition that the North has made substantial progress in its nuclear weapons program. Let's do that. But please, we should not delude ourselves and deter ourselves by creating an equivalency between North Korean capability and American strategic nuclear weapons capability. That's pure nonsense. And anybody that looks at numbers and systems can see that. Third, the conventional force balance. I think we can be amazed by the progress the North has made. We can look at their military parades, look at the weapon systems that are put out there. But at the end of the day, we should have confidence in our ability we, the United States, to execute our responsibilities with our allies and indeed the credibility of our extended deterrence, which begins with our conventional military capability and is unmatched on the planet. So I think we have to remember where we start from. And if we go into the negotiations wanting the outcome I described and recognize we're going into the negotiations from a position of strength with our allies, I think there's a possibility at least we could achieve the objective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You raised so many questions and then the suggestions and insights actually. And my feeling is you're becoming a little bit more realistic and then in a way combination of the two or middle ground. I think you become to like it, if I may. I'm right, especially. Combination of the first part you talked about the combination of bottom up and top down. So summit meeting is okay, but before that, the high level senior meeting, I think is really important. People are kind of categorized. Trump administration top down, and Biden and bottom up. I think it's why not we use both. I think it's completely possible and other important suggestion that even though I cannot call it, but the last part, another part is this is not to be idealistic and not to be too realistic. I totally agree with it. Ironically, in Washington, everybody agrees, regardless of their position before. Come to the conclusion that North Korea is not going to denuclearize. Then what? Then nothing we can do about it. I think, and especially Kim Jong-un never said it on conditional denuclearizations. He always talked about conditional. It's got to be better than keeping the nuclear weapon. So decision is ours. Should we provide that or not? I think it is important. I think fundamental question we have to ask. Okay. Now we have two Korean experts and former Vice Minister Chun Hae-sung. Your turn. Thank you very much.
예, 안녕하십니까.
Hello, it is a pleasure to meet you. My name is Chun Hae-sung. It's a pleasure for me to see Mr. Gallucci. Thank you very much. I haven't seen you in a while. Thank you very much for the very specific suggestions that you gave in the open remarks. And also to Mr. Wong. It's been a while since I've met you as well. I remember right before the 2019 Hanoi summit where you visited Pyongyang and then had that negotiations with North Korea, then came to Seoul to meet with some of the people here at the ministry to tell us, debrief us of what your meeting was like with DPRK. Thank you very much. I did remember to thank you then, I hope, but I also would like to thank you again now for your very hard work. I did just touch upon Hanoi, but after the derailment of talks at the Hanoi summit, we've seen a lot of stalemate here, DPRK-Korea relations, US-DPRK relations, and it's very frustrating for us here. In January, after the launch of the Biden administration, as you know, they've been going through a policy review of their North Korea policy. The DPRK also had that 8th Party Congress in January, as you know, and they've been talking about how they're going to be really focusing on their own self-reliance and that they're going to take a sort of reserved position and a wait-and-see position towards the U.S. and DPRK. And also this is due in part because of the coronavirus situation. And there's some limited joint U.S. Korea military exercises, some restrained exercises. Many members of the media are very interested in what's going to happen with the South Korean DPRK. The SMA was reached not long ago. There was very long negotiations leading up to that conclusion of the SMA. I understand it was a very fruitful meeting, fruitful conclusion. And I think that this is a good signal sent by the Biden administration, a good start to what he said, that he's going to revert back to a strong trust in the alliance. I think that many of the people positioned to carry out the DPRK policies are experts both in Korea and both in the US, and they are equipped with the necessary capacity to do very well in their jobs. And you did mention this, but next week there's going to be the 2+2 summit in Seoul. I believe the ministers are going to be talking about SMA, various different current issues surrounding the Chorus Alliance, what they're going to do for a more robust Chorus Alliance. And obviously, they will likely touch upon the DPRK issue on how to proceed the Korean Peninsula peace process. They're going to be talking about some specific visible progress. At least I hope that they will be talking about some specific visible plans and steps that we can take. The US-DPRK relations that we've seen over the past few years has been very interesting. I think that there is some, a little bit of us might be disappointed, but overall, I think there's been some progress made. The Sentosa agreement was very significant, and although the Hanoi summit ended in a derailment, I think that the Hanoi summit in and of itself was very meaningful as well. The Panmunjom meeting was very significant as well. Through these different processes, the US, DPRK, and the ROK were better able to understand what each other wants and what they can give and take, so to speak, with the nuclear program. There's been sufficient conversations had, and so although the Hanoi summit ended in a less than desirable way, I think that we have a better understanding of where to go in the future and what we should do in terms of negotiating the Korean Peninsula peace process. I think that foundation has been laid over the past few years. That the summits, so the leaders of the US-DPRK and the ROK were really at the forefront trying to lead these negotiations to get the ball rolling. And if we take into consideration the different characteristics of our different administrations, I think that right now we have a very solid foundation for us to use as a starting point to go forward into the future. So now we have to really think about what we should do practically and concretely for the future. I think the ROK administration, of course, and the Biden administration. The Biden administration is going through a policy review of the DPRK policy, but I think that the DPRK and the ROK administration are being very prudent and very stable in their management of the current situation. So that is how I evaluate their current situation right now. They're being very stable in their management. I know that there have been concerns about the US-Korea joint military exercises, but I think that these joint military exercises have been carried out in a way that is appropriate for the current time and in a restrained format. And I think the DPRK sees that. Right now, this policy review would also be managed prudently and stably, and I think that is the key challenge for now, for the current moment. And once we get past these different issues right now, and the policy review is complete, and we can take a look at the DPRK policy coming out of the U.S. administration and see where we'll go in the future. Right now, I believe that there are close communications being had between the U.S. and ROK side. I don't think we have the details because they're not in a position to reveal that information to the public, but I would like to think that there is close communication that is being had between the working level parties at the U.S. and the ROK. I think that the United States-North Korea policy might yield, after the policy review, might yield some new surprises, but I think that it would also look at some of the key principles that we've had adhered to in the past. So some of which is that the denuclearization process needs to be looked at comprehensively, and it's going to take a long time to fix, and we need to take a more phased and more realistic approach. Some of these core principles would likely continue to apply in the North Korea policy even after the review. So I think that the US and ROK policymakers, they have a shared understanding about that. So based on this shared understanding, they can come up with realistic and practical policy measures going forward. And so at an appropriate time, perhaps they can enter into some strategic collaborations on what to do with the DPRK based on that policy. As for the time frame, we've just heard from the Chancellor that the media has reported that the policy review might end sometime soon, maybe even at the end of this month. I personally think that it would be great if the policy review would end sooner rather than later, but based on my experience working at the government, I think it's very careful. You shouldn't really jump to coming up with a very exact, a very specific time frame, because I mean they can say that it might happen by the end of this month, but sometime it could be postponed. And if it's postponed, that people are going to start talking about different rumors that, oh my gosh, there must be some kind of misunderstanding, that there must be some kind of concerns. So I think that, yes, it could be good if we can have an outcome sooner than later, but it's better if we have a good outcome, a good policy review. And that's more important. So we should try to be patient and watch and see what happens and what comes out of the policy review. So for the time being, I know that the DPRK is going through a very difficult situation right now because of COVID-19, and I think that for us to overcome this situation, the DPRK would really want a more favorable international environment for them, and the U.S. understands that in going through the policy review. And with that understanding and with the close cooperation with the ROK side, hopefully very soon, the US-DPRK and DPRK-ROK dialogue will resume. And if I could just add one last point, I have been working in the Ministry of Unification for the last 30 years or so, focusing mostly on the DPRK-ROK relations. So yes, this is really an urgent matter right now for the Korean Peninsula. We have to resolve the North Korea nuclear issue. I don't think there is any opposition to that, but in the process of resolving the DPRK nuclear issue, we also need to have good relations with Korea, ROK, with the international community. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of voices and comments being made. And I think it's important for us to be aware of all of that, and that our approach towards the DPRK and our relations with the DPRK should be looked at as importantly as our relations with the United States and with the international community. This is a common stance that the past administrations in the ROK have had. So in the process of resolving the DPRK issue, the DPRK-ROK talks and dialogues and cooperation, especially perhaps some COVID-19 related cooperation, should be also looked at, closely cooperated on. So if need be, then ROK can move a little bit quicker in that regard in cooperating closely with the DPRK. I think the DPRK would also be cognizant of this fact. And we all need to be a little bit wise and prudent in carrying out these measures. Thank you.
Very much. Minister Chun Hae-sung, actually, you're very cautious, became very cautious. You know, maybe is it because your experience in 2018, which was very dramatic and speed up a process. So maybe you're disappointed or frustrated from your experience. So now you're emphasizing more cautious approach and kind of managing the situations before we start the process. I think we have no choice. You know, for several months, I think we have to wait. But maybe the second part of this year can be another starting point. But anyways, I'll get to you with the more concrete questions, and then the last presenter, Dr. Sang-Ye Kim. So you recently wrote about the theory of North Korean collapse. So you vehemently deny the possibility. So if you include that part in your presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Kim Sang-gi from KINU. I'm greatly honored to be part of this very important expert discussion, especially Vice Minister Chun Hae-sung. It's been a while since I saw you last, and also Dr. Galuzzi. When I was in the United States on my business trip, we have had a series of meetings, and I was able to meet you there, and it's so great to see you again. And also Deputy Special Representative Alex Wong. 2 years ago, when I was working at the Ministry of Unification, I think we had a chance to work together, both in the United States as well as back in Korea, having such fond memories of those meetings. So I'm very glad to see my colleagues. So before I begin my presentation, Dr. Kim asked me to talk about the collapse, the theory of the collapse of the North Korean regime, how I denounce the possibilities of the collapse. So let me start with that first of all. Well, within the United States circle, I think there's still a lot of discussions on the possible collapse of the North Korean regime. But in my last column, as I pointed out very clearly, I do not think that there's a lot of possibilities for that, a very bleak possibility, to say the least. True that the North Korean economy is facing a lot of difficulties due to the sanctions regime, but it is still able to secure survival, the engines for securing its own survival. So true that there are a lot of challenges, but there's really little possibility that the North Korean regime will come to collapse. And what's really important is that we shouldn't be designing our North Korea policy thinking that there will be a collapse of the North Korean regime, because that could really mean the equation for failure. So let me go back to the topic of this experts discussion. Recently, especially looking at the North Korean position and the developments in the North Korean region, as well as the Biden administration's policy toward North Korea, as well as the former Trump's administration's North Korea policy. As you may be very well aware, looking at the North Korean situations, there was an eighth party Congress, which clearly showed that it is actually asking the United States to withdraw its hostile policy, and it is going to take corresponding measures in response to whatever the policy stance that is taken by the new administration. True that there are a lot of internal difficulties within the country. So it is very much going to focus on managing and controlling its current situations in a stable manner. And while doing so, with the launch of the new administration in the United States, it is now waiting to see the type of a policy that will come out from the current administration, whether there'll be any changes in terms of the U.S. policy towards North Korea. I think it is taking a wait-and-see approach in that regard. What's really noticeable over here is that, as I mentioned before, starting from the presidential election last year in the United States and up until a recent point, whether it is by its deeds or words, it is refraining from making any provocative comments or comments or words about the U.S. administration. In other words, for example, it is waiting for that policy review outcome to come out of the administration. So it is really paying a lot of attention to what policy will come out of the administration, and while it's refraining from making any provocative comments against the administration. In that regards, it is really important to see what the new administration's policy toward North Korea will be. As was mentioned by other discussants, it is currently undergoing a review, and it is currently in the formal process, and the process is currently underway. But if you look at other high-level officials or the Biden administration, looking at their comments to the public, I think we can safely assume certain directions that may come out of the policy review. First of all, in terms of arms control, there will be a gradual approach. There is a possibility that the new administration may take a gradual approach towards arms control. Within a big framework, non-proliferation and arms control are going to be taken as important elements of the policy. And of course, North Korea's nuclear issues will also be included in those options as well. And as for the Secretary of State Blinken, for the JCPOA, he mentioned that JCPOA could be used as a benchmark for the nuclear negotiations with North Korea. There was also a press interview last year, at the end of last year, where Blinken said that we cannot expect all the issues to be resolved overnight with North Korea. So denuclearization will not take place overnight. And we're really left with no options but to take a gradual approach to denuclearization issues. And against that backdrop, I think the policy will be very much based on a gradual approach using arms control methods. Of course, there are uncertainties, and we cannot really say with 100% assurance that that is going to be the case. And on the other hand, there is also a concerning fact that in terms of deterrence and management, the policy may tilt towards deterrence and managing the situations. Up until now, for the last 30 years, the North Korean nuclear issue has remained unsolved, while the North Korean nuclear capabilities became more advanced. And the North Korean nuclear issue is now becoming a very critical challenge for the Washington Circle, something that's really difficult to tackle. And as such, maybe having an early negotiation and talk with the North Korea, rather than going in that route, I think the U.S. administration will tilt towards deterring the nuclear capabilities of North Korea while continuing to impose sanctions on the regime. So it will be very difficult for us to rule out such possibility of using two different options at the same time. Now, going back to the Obama administration, there was an initiative for strategic patience. I don't think that we should be going in that route, but we cannot rule out the possibility that the administration may want to revert to the Obama period. I think really has to do a lot with its relations with China, because the current Biden administration is also undertaking a policy to contain the Chinese government. Now, with that in the equation, if, for example, North Korean nuclear issue is considered as part of that big problem, then the arms control gradual approach maybe should be undertaken, but the United States might want the North Korean regime to actually take some early actions first. So if you go in that direction, especially if the U.S. policy focuses very much on containment and management, or deterrence and management, the North Korean nuclear issue is going to be a very intractable challenge. And in the meantime, the North Korean nuclear capabilities will become more sophisticated than ever before. And as such, what I want to emphasize over here is that there will be a gradual approach, or the U.S. administration should take a more gradual approach towards arms control to resolve North Korean nuclear issues. And I think it was last week when the Biden administration announced a provisional tentative guideline for the national security policy. There was also a comment related to North Korean nuclear issues, that one of the key tasks is to reduce the nuclear threat from North Korea. Of course, we shouldn't really take this out of context, but looking at that specific wording in that guideline, the current administration is considering an option of taking a gradual approach towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, although there are a lot of uncertainties at present. Another point that I want to indicate is going back to the Trump administration's policy towards North Korea. What really comes to our mind is, as was mentioned by other panelists, there was a historical summit between DPRK and the United States, and the Singapore declaration or statement that came out as a very significant outcome. And another point that I want to make here is that one of the elements that actually enable that summit to take place is that the Trump administration's policy towards North Korea, it really didn't base its policy on ideology. That is a very critical element over here. That means that the United States actually looked at North Korea as a partner for dialogue rather than just treating the North Korean regime based on ideological framework. That's why it led to, for example, the summit meeting between the two leaders. And of course, we're currently in the state of stalemate ever since the Hanoi No Deal Summit. But the Korean Peninsula peace process was able to produce such results precisely because of the fact that the Trump administration's stance towards North Korea was different. It was not based on, for example, the value sets or ideology like the previous administrations. I think that really played a significant role. And that is something to be considered for the new Biden administration as well, as it reshapes its policy towards North Korea. So let me end with that point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we talked about the theory of North Korean collapse. Yeah, I always think, people who support this or spread this, coming of North Korean regime collapse is like, people, heretic people actually, second coming of Jesus. And then nothing happens, and they disappeared. And then, situation got worse, or crisis situation, or deadlock came, and that came back like a zombie. And then again, they tried to spread the coming of the regime collapse. And yeah, I do agree with that. They're having a hard time, especially, three hardships, sanctions and corona, and the natural disasters in the last summertime. I think they have a hard time, but somehow they survived. And for the past 30 years, we misjudged that the North Korean ability to survive. They're having a hard time, but they still can survive. Excuse me. And then you talked about North Korean thinking they kind of wait and see. I called it North Korean version of strategic patience, but I don't think it could last 8 years. Maybe they can. I think they could wait 6 months or until this end of this year, if we give them a positive signal. I don't think they completely break the table beforehand. And yeah, I think its North Korean agenda is a negative agenda, high risk, low returns. So it's not very popular, politically popular. If some concede something to this dictatorship country, but I think at the end of the day and in the long run, I think we should resolve these issues. I think it fits the Democratic Party's vision. And you talked about the contribution that the Trump administration that not demonized the North Korean and treat them as a partner. So we heard all the presentations, initial presentation. So if you have any comments or you missed the point that during your presentation or cross-check or questions, so why don't we have that time session now? You raise or 2 minute two finger or something? Nothing? Why? Okay, go ahead, Alex.
Well, again, thank you for everyone's comments. Always great to learn from my colleagues and your deep experiences and analysis. I want to touch on something that Sang-Ki brought up, and that was kind of spread throughout some of the comments on this concept of a move to an arms control concept. I know that this is not just being discussed in this format or in this forum. It's being discussed elsewhere. I've seen it in other commentary, particularly as the Biden team is considering its policy going forward. You know, I understand the attraction to an arms control framework. You know, you particularly if you have experts who have experience and knowledge of the arms control relationship that the U.S. has with Russia and previously with the Soviet Union, it's tempting to take that framework and that approach and apply it to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. I would say, however, that if you look at the U.S.-Soviet arms control regime and framework, whatever you want to label it, it arose from a situation and made strategic sense in a situation where you had a bipolar world, where you had two superpowers with growing nuclear arsenals, where you had a lack of transparency between Moscow and Washington, where you had a number of, even though it was a Cold War, at least that's what they called it, a number of hot proxy wars throughout the world, and high probability of miscalculation, or at least not a high at least a high cost that if there is a miscalculation, it would result in catastrophe, not just for the United States and Soviet Union, but for the rest of the world, for all of humanity. So an arms control framework in that context made sense, not just for the United States, but made sense for the Soviet Union, and made sense for our allies and for, at the time, the Soviet world. That's not what we have here with North Korea. You know, when we look at South Korea, when we look at the United States, when we look at the free world and our allies, and then when you look at North Korea, it's simply not the same situation. It's not a bipolar world. It's not, North Korea is not what the Soviet Union was. That's not to put them down. It's just not the strategic situation that we have. So I would caution against taking the allure of what we have in the arms control situation with the Soviet Union and with Russia now and applying it to this context. That's number one. Number two, I would also say one of the big dangers we have as we proceed with our policy in North Korea is not simply the North Korean WMD arsenal, although that is a dire threat and a dire concern for us and our allies. It's also the proliferation question, that if we don't succeed or we make a mistake or a miscalculation, that will create the wrong incentives, not just within the Indo-Pacific region, but throughout the world, for regimes to pursue nuclear weapons. And right now, I think we have a situation where we are maintaining the consensus, the non-proliferation consensus, because we have the stringent sanctions, the isolation, the general disapproval of the international community of North Korea's pursuit and production of WMD. You know, very few nations in the world would make the decision that North Korea has, which is to endure the isolation, endure the biting sanctions, to endure the diplomatic isolation in exchange for the arsenal that they've managed to produce. If we move to an arms control framework, implying that some level of arsenal is fine at the end of the day, at the end of the process, that risks creating wrong incentives. That creates the possibility that we will fray the consensus on non-proliferation. And that's not just a threat, you know, on the peninsula or in the region, that's a threat around the world. So we have to keep these things in mind, understand the wider strategic concept that applies in this situation, and be careful to husband the consensus that we've all worked so hard on over the past half century to create on non-proliferation. I'll stop there.
I think you raised a very, very important and very complicated issue that, you know, Dr. Kim brought up this issue of, you know, I think it's just not just arms control issues, but also he brings up the possibility of phased approach, or we call it interim agreement. And, you know, as I said before, in Washington, everybody's came to the conclusion that North Korea is not going to denuclearize. Then the same conclusion, but then what? And some people say that just more pressure on another strategic patience. But some people say that at least we have to reduce the threat. So maybe this arms control is one of the way. I think we have to see these issues in the big picture. I think it's very important. And I want to ask you, is it how much this the approach of phased or accepting interim agreement, and what's the right now is a map of the argument in Washington. I want to ask the 12 American friends, and then is it desirable? Is it workable? I think it's, let me ask you too. Why don't Ambassador Galucci first, and then I'll get back to you, Alex.
It's interesting, Jun Wong, that you had phrased that question, because I was thinking of asking you maybe the other side of that question. I very much would like to hear what you think the gaps are, or the differences, either philosophically or practically, between the Moon administration. If you asked the president, to President Moon, to say what he wants the U.S. to do now to engage the North, and how, what do you think the gaps are between an ROK approach of at least this government, which has another year or so, I understand, between that the way you would all proceed, as opposed to what it appears that the Biden administration would do. I'm interested in, if you'll forgive me, the alliance question here. I mean, yes, one of the parameters might be the extent to which we engage in action for action, or reciprocity, or step for step, that kind of thing. That's a practical question, and it goes to how one views these negotiations and how they're likely to succeed. But I'm actually interested in the view from 30,000 feet, whether there is really a strategic difference between Seoul and Washington here. Another way of, lots of ways of framing this. Are the meetings going to be tough that are coming up, or is there going to be a love fest in which we agree the alliance is strong, work together, we're going to proceed? I hear has been talk, and I didn't know whether it was a function of the Trump administration and the critique that President Trump suffered of being of undervaluing his allies and taking on good relations with parties we thought we were hostile to. There's a lot of this was American domestic politics, but I wondered how much gap there really is substantively. Is this? I mean, I can spin this out more. Are you all in Seoul more likely to go to a risk-taking posture, right? Or are you likely to be softer on sanctions so you can get more North-South engagement? I'd really like to understand that.
I think it's Minister Chun. I think you should answer the question. And
말씀드리겠습니다.
Okay, I will try to give my opinion. So, all right, I think we posed the question to our American colleagues, but you've posed the question back to us, and that's interesting. There have been so many discussions over the many years on DPRK policy, DPRK nuclear issue, and I think that these discussions have changed slightly depending on which administration was in power. And at the time, there were different contexts, and there were different situational awareness over the years. And now that we have a new administration in the United States, the DPRK issue and the Korean Peninsula peace process, I did mention this before. This is not a 100-meter race. It's not a sprint. It's not something that we can just focus our like resources for 1 or 2 years and have it resolved. This is a very long marathon, and this means that DPRK is one side, but this marathon has many athletes, many players there. There's DPRK on one side, but there's also the US and ROK side. And because the US and ROK are democracies, there's going to be changes in the administration. And so it's like a relay. And it's important for the different administrations to pass the baton over to each other very smoothly in this relay marathon. And right now, I think that we're in another transitional stage, which is why I mentioned before in my opening remarks that it's very important for us to be very prudent and stably manage this current situation. I'm not saying that we should maintain the status quo, but I think that it's important for us to be very wise and prudent in our management of the situation right now, especially when when Washington is going through policy review. And someone mentioned that the DPRK is going through its own brand of strategic awareness, strategic patience, and that it's going to last for maybe 6 months or so. And you've been a little bit positive in that, but I'm a little bit concerned. If we make it last too long, that might be problematic. I don't think we need to test the level of strategic patience that the DPRK has. Hopefully, I hope that the policy review will be over with quicker than that. Obviously, I did talk about before about imposing a time frame, but we still want to try to be sooner rather than later. I mean, we don't want to let this drag this on too long, because we also want to give some time for the DPRK to react to the policy. And it's important that we engage in close collaboration with the U.S. side to discuss what we should do with our stance regarding sanctions, whether we're going to be more flexible with sanctions or whether we're going to be more stringent with sanctions. I think that in Korea, the current administration, the unification minister, even during the difficult situation of 2018, 2019, our basic stance was we're going to maintain the international sanctions, but we're going to try to be flexible if we can. But it was the DPRK side that has been saying that they don't want any relief or they don't want any aid. But in any case, I think that when it comes to the roles and responsibilities of the U.S. and the ROK, we can be rest assured because many of the people in Washington and in Seoul, they are very seasoned professionals with a lot of experience. So they can do a very good job with talking about roles and responsibilities and later on give an official position on the roles that they've discussed. And I understand that they will probably be engaged in very close cooperation and communication right now. And I don't think that there's going to be a lot of difficulty in assigning that. Lastly, we've been talking about arms control. Some people have been discussing that here, even at this forum. But I think that many scholars and experts in the U.S. and elsewhere have been looking at these different arms control negotiations, these different models, and try to present some alternatives. But I think shouldn't be any misunderstandings. This shouldn't go the way under the premise that we recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state. There's always going to be that basic premise that we go for denuclearization. However, with that in mind, we should think about a phased approach. I think that is what people are saying, that we should think about a phased approach because they have the nuclear weapons right now. So recognizing that they have those nuclear weapons right now, without recognizing them as an official nuclear state, we have to think about managing this situation prudently in a phased and step-by-step approach, to try to take what we can from past arms control situation and past arms control experiences and take lessons learned from that and apply what we can while still maintaining the core principle that ultimately what we're going for is denuclearization. I think that is what some of these scholars and experts have in mind when they talk about going forward with an arms control situation.
His comment is, always, President Moon is very cautious and practical person. And sometimes progressives are complain about his not, dare to go ahead. He always say not even one step further, just half step further, even if he tried to inter-Korean, cooperation. Actually, that frustrates North Korea. And he's a vision and an objective is very high, but that he's a very cautious person. And that's why sometimes he put himself in the sandwich by these two sides. And regarding the right now, what's going on between the Biden and Moon, the mood is so good, at least for now. And the attitude of Biden administration is listen to ally. Don't make our ally uncomfortable. That's their basic posture. I know, but even if they said that later on, that doesn't guarantee that they accepted all the advices. But right now is, some media here and there, Biden is kind of pressuring Korea about alliance or, trilateral cooperation among Japan, Korea and the US and Quad and in the Pacific. That's not true as far as I know. At this stage, it's more like you try to recover. So maybe next week's visit also, I don't think is a visit for pressuring in South Korean government. Let me go back to, because you asked questions, so I have to go back to the original questions. So what's the right now is the map of the argument in Washington about this interim, whatever you call it, some people call it freezing first and then denucleate later. So, and is it desirable? Is it workable? So let me go back to Ambassador Carlucci and Alex.
So I think you're right that in the US right now, I characterize them as super realists. The argument has been, as I understand it, that by insisting on denuclearization, the goal, never mind the process, that we are as we used to say, we're smoking something funny here. That real people would understand by now, having gone through the Clinton administration, and then the Bush administration, and then the Obama administration, and then the Trump administration, with successive pledges from the North by the father, the son, and the grandson that they were going to denuclearize, that we should have figured out by now that they're not going to denuclearize, and that we would be wise, prudent, if we put that goal aside and accepted the way they have observed the model for the North Koreans must be India. Not so much Pakistan, but we did the deal with India 15 years ago. And that would be good, I think, from the North Korean perspective. That accepts the, quote, legitimacy of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. So that's what I'm arguing against. I understand that one can get frustrated over years of trying to do this, over repeated promises of various members of the Kim family that they are prepared to do this, but instead watching go from becoming a non-nuclear weapon state with some nuclear weapons capability to a state that acquires nuclear weapons and then acquires potentially thermonuclear weapons, and then delivery capabilities of ever increasing sophistication and range. So the question is the fair one to ask: when are we going to get real in the United States about our objectives? And my view here is that it is at least plausible that the North would value a normal relationship with the United States and the international community over having nuclear weapons whose principal utility is to prevent an effort by the United States to attempt regime change or at least that's how North Koreans have explained it to me. So so if that's true, then I think the key question, and I've had this discussion with North Koreans, is how does the United States make credible any assurance that it will not attempt regime change so that the North could still meet its security objective and become a non-nuclear weapon state? And the only way I can see that happening is if the United States and North Korea have a normal relationship. I said, I hope you in South Korea will forgive me for this, but I said to the North Koreans, look, what's the difference between North Korea and South Korea? A political system, an economic system, but there's nothing geopolitically different. They are in the same place. They're on the same peninsula. They're the same people, actually. They're Koreans. And we don't, in South Korea, I've never heard South Korean concern about the United States launching an effort at regime change in Seoul, right? They're an ally of ours. Why can't we move at least to détente, if not entente, with the North? Why can't we improve that relationship? And I said, I don't want to make light of the economic and political differences, but the material manifestation of that's an obstacle to our relationship, is really human rights policy. And whether you are in the United States a human rights advocate or one who thinks it gets in the way of realistic foreign policy, whichever you are, my view is, in this case, you should favor an improvement in human rights in the North so that a more normal relationship can exist between the DPRK and the USA. If for no other reason, it's a very realistic objective, wholly apart from the ethical appeal of a human rights policy. So, when I think about all this, I think that it is possible for us to make progress on the denuclearization goal. It isn't, please understand that when one of my colleagues, who I have great respect for and I worked with for many years in state, Robert Einhorn, I've heard him argue that we need way stations, and that's okay with me. A freeze, as long as it's verifiable, and we know that it's real. A freeze can be substantive. I remember I talked about substantive steps. Shutting down facilities at Yangbin. People say, well, if they're very old, it doesn't matter. Of course, it matters. They don't have any other operating reactor but that same old crummy 5 megawatt electric reactor. Right? They don't have, to the best of our knowledge, a reprocessing plant anywhere else, any other source of plutonium or tritium. So it's not trivial. Plus, there's an enrichment facility there. So I can imagine steps towards denuclearization that have a material value to the U.S., to the South Korea, and to Japan, and it be short of denuclearization. I want the goal to remain denuclearization. I would like to have innovation in North Korean weapons halted. No more tests, right? No more tests of long range or even medium and IRBM missiles, right? Stop that. I mean, there are things we can achieve short of full denuclearization that are valuable, but I don't think we should give up on the goal. And I don't see why, actually, it's unattainable. I do see why it's provocative, and it can be in Seoul and Tokyo, for the United States to give up on the goal. I'm not interested in seeing the NPT unravel beginning in Northeast Asia any more than I am interested in seeing it unravel in the Middle East beginning with Iran. So I don't think there's an iron rule of dominoes with respect to proliferation, but it's clear countries' calculations are influenced by what other neighboring countries do. And I worry about that. So I've spoken long enough here, and I apologize for that, but I really feel a desire to end denuclearization.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yeah, I think it's, sometimes we have some kind of myth here in Washington and Seoul too. North Korea is always interested in food. food economy. Still? Oh. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Ambassadors, you have a hard time? But why is that? Okay. Still? No?
Okay, hear you now.
Fine.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Somehow. Okay. Yeah, I think it's U.S. and Korea has some kind of myth about the North Korean, perception. We think we have this kind of myth that the North Korea is only interested in food and economic well-being. I think these days they are more interested in the survival. I think is security issues, especially after 2017. They have they felt a stark security threat. So I think we have considered that. I think Ambassador Gallucci emphasized that, and I totally agree with that. And second one is, this is, I think you're right. The long-term denuclearizations, should be a goal. And then, this interim agreement things that maybe can be attacked in Korea too. Then what? U.S. has stopped the ICBM capability. This is conspiracy theory. U.S. is compromised with North Korea. No more ICBM, but you can have your already made nuclear bomb. So that's the political, of course, political attack. But we have to agree on the denuclearizations. No question about it. Then how you put this interim agreement, because Alex raised the danger of this kind of approach. So maybe Alex, you have a little bit different opinion about this?
So I think this is a good discussion because we need to be clear on defining the terms that we're using. And I find myself agreeing with Ambassador Gallucci on much of what he said. I think we're on the same page on this. I mean, there are many configurations we can talk about as far as sequencing of actions between the DPRK and South Korea and the United States in an ultimate deal on denuclearization and other changes to our relationship. But I think it's important before settling on those actions, which we have to do in a negotiation with the DPRK, is to settle on these end states. And that is something that we strove very hard in our working level negotiations in the Trump years to do. And again, not just on the end state of where the North Korean WMD program would be, but also on what the overall security framework would be with the DPRK in Northeast Asia. Also on the economic relationship, on where the DPRK would be in relation to South Korea and the region and the United States on an economic basis. President Trump liked to refer to it as a brighter future, and we use that term. But we want to flesh that out. But also the political and diplomatic relationship. Where do we get to the normalization? And then also on humanitarian actions, healing the wounds of war, people-to-people exchanges, other actions to build trust between the people of North Korea, the people of the United States, and South Korea as well. These are all end states that I think need to be fleshed out because they're at base strategic questions. These are, what is the strategic resting state that we want to get to in this negotiation? And it needs to be a strategic solution, and those end states, that strategic resting state needs to be defined, because the reason the DPRK has these weapons and it's pursued these weapons is for strategic reasons. You mentioned, Jun Hyung, that there's been perhaps an overemphasis in years past on small trades, fuel oil for certain actions, light water reactor reactions. I'm not criticizing these efforts, other than to say that if we're going to have a solution, it has to be a wider deal, as Ambassador Gallucci said, because the underlying motivations of the DPRK are strategic. So I don't think we're disagreeing on that, but I do emphasize that an agreement and a fleshing out and an honest discussion on the end states that we're trying to achieve in North Korea really is vital to having this be a sustainable and successful negotiation and ultimate agreement that's going to be reached.
Quick questions actually for you before to go into our Korean colleagues. You talked about that, this North Korean attitude, actually I slipped on my mind. Okay. I woke up too early in the morning. Okay. Oh, okay. This flesh out this process and end state. And in Hanoi meeting, U.S. American side talked about a lot about this, definition of denuclearization, and then the CVID. Actually, personally, I think is a myth, but they agree on this, declaration, Singapore declarations, complete denuclearization. Why do we have to argue this? Is exact what picture, or digging into this, the end state makes starting harder. So I agree with you. We have to agree on what the end state is, but is it too kind of too much on this? Can be a big hurdle to start? And the Ambassador College says we need to start kind of a jump start a little bit, and then if we go back to again this talk about the end state and then the roadmap and then until you agree, we cannot do anything and things like that. What kind of that kind of danger?
That's a question for me, Jun Hyung. So, I don't think that's the biggest hurdle to progress with North Korea. In our talks with the North Koreans, particularly before Hanoi, the biggest problem simply was that the negotiating team had not yet been empowered to really talk denuclearization. Yes, we had the Singapore Summit joint statement, which I think is a very good framework because it lays out 4 large avenues for or pillars for negotiation. But everyone can see that 2-page document is aspirational, or at least it's broad. It needs to be filled out. I mean, that's what you do in a working level negotiation. And discussing what denuclearization means on the peninsula, laying out what we're working towards, but at the same time offering the economic aspiration and fleshing that out, discussing the diplomatic aspiration and what that means to have a transformed relationship. If Kim Jong-un and the Kim regime are ready to take a strategic step, they have to be ready to discuss that. And that's simply the team that they had in Hanoi simply wasn't empowered to discuss that yet. One thing that I will watch very closely, and did watch for and will continue to watch for, and something that I urge greatly the North Koreans to do, was to get a team together that, you can use this term empowered, of course they have to be empowered, but also one that drew from the various ministries that would have to be involved in crafting a roadmap. Of course, you're talking about the missile departments, we're talking about the military and the nuclear departments, but we're also talking about their internal economic ministries as well as the MFA. We never got that full phalanx of ministry interlocutors. The United States brought it. We had a full team, not just from the State Department, but from the White House, from Treasury, from Department of Defense. We even had our aid experts on tap. But until they're serious about that, fully empowered to talk about the broad, again, strategic change, it's going to be very difficult to have a fruitful negotiation. And that has to come from the top. That has to come from a strategic decision from the North Koreans. I hope they do make that decision.
Thank you very much. I have a question for our Korean colleagues. Dr. Kim, you heard the American colleagues' idea or their suggestions for interim government and the negative side and the possible danger. So in your opinion, what kind of interim agreement? In my opinion, actually, I think high possibility because JCPOA is kind of interim agreement, and the Hanoi package, even if it's it failed, is a interim agreement in a way if it succeeds. So, in my opinion, actually repackage of the Hanoi agreement is maybe most realistic. So, I want to ask your opinion on that.
So, speaking of that issue, Deputy Special Representative Alex Wong just rightly pointed out about the implications regarding the arms control approach that was taken by the USSR and the United States during the Cold War. So let me touch upon that first. I agree with you on that. The fact that you're looking at this with a very different approach. Of course, even if we're talking about arms control, this is not going to take on a shape like the one we saw during the Cold War. We're not trying to just directly apply that methodology to the current North Korean situation. I think that's just going to be impossible. But we have to look at the distribution of power between USSR and US, as well as United States and DPRK. It's very difficult to draw any comparison between two different states. So realistically, we're not going to be able to adopt the same arms control approach to the North Korean situation. And this was also mentioned by Vice Minister Chun Hae-sung, that when we're taking a gradual approach towards arms control, that doesn't mean that we're recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state or we're abandoning the ultimate goal of denuclearization of North Korea. It's exactly opposite of that. That means we're having a containment, check and balances, but because we cannot achieve this goal overnight, realistically speaking, we have to take gradual step-by-step approach towards that ultimate goal. That's what I meant to say. And of course, there has to be simultaneous exchange, for example, between the United States and DPRK. There has to be quid pro quo, give and take approach between the two countries. So I wanted to just touch upon that topic. And going back to the question that was posed by Dr. Kim, which is very similar to this is very similar to the gradual approach that we've been talking about. So Hanoi summit, of course, ended with no deal, but still there are a lot of implications to be drawn, and they can be used as good lessons for any future meetings between DPRK and the United States. The fact that we had a failed summit could actually serve as a very good lesson going forward. Going back to that time in Hanoi, the Yangbin nuclear facilities dismantlement, there was a permanent dismantlement proposed by the North Korean side for the Yangbin nuclear facilities. And what they really wanted from the North Korean, from the United States, is the sanctions relief. In return for that, so the conditions for this negotiation, of course, will need to be revisited and reviewed. And the Biden administration may want more than just the dismantlement of the Yangbin facilities, and North Koreans may want more than just sanctions relief. But all of these different factors would have to be taken into consideration that would enable some type of an exchange, a give and take between the United States and DPRK. And there has to be an interim agreement towards that goal. And what I want to stress at this point is that when we've already experienced from the Hanoi summit, having the snapback provision for the sanctions regime, on condition that there is a snapback provision included. I think this is a very good idea to entertain at this point of time. That was 28th in February back then. It was not known to the public right away. And I think it was back in 2019, the middle of March, that Choi Sang-hee had a press conference in Pyongyang. the foreign minister, said that in the process of negotiation with the United States, for example, if the North Korea, for example, violates any provisions that the sanctions regime can be reinstated, which would be executed by the snapback provision. But according to Choi Sang-hee, the North Korean regime actually made the proposal, but which was rejected by the United States. That's what she said. But because Alex was probably, you were very deeply involved in the process, you would probably know more than what I know. But this sanctions relief in condition for snapback provision, that was actually initiated and brought about by the North Korean side. So in the nuclear negotiations, that could be reinitiated in the future if such snapback provision can be proposed or can be leveraged in the early phase of negotiations, then it could actually go a long way towards making some substantial progress in negotiations with North Koreans. Thank you, and I will end with that point.
We have only 20 minutes, not even 20 minutes. So before I go the last the round, let me ask 우리 천혜성 차관님. I talked about this, little, as you said, is in your term is more kind of a positive, optimistic about the North Korean response in coming month. I said the only condition that we can give them a positive signal. And I don't think the North Korean version of strategic patience can last long. I agree with that. But the point is that, the pattern, many people talked about the pattern that if they are, ignored or the time of waiting is too long, then they will surely provoke. I don't think that's the case this time. I think at least they wait longer than before. At least let me put that way. And my question for you is, Ambassador Gallucci talked about what's our plan. I talked about what should be our plan. If this current mood is their listening mode, then which one we should we put forward, and which is the best advice at this time, and what's our plan? Should be our plan.
예, 뭐 지금
Yes, I think that the people in charge are likely brainstorming that very heavily right now. The nuclear issue, we need to take a long-term approach and a very comprehensive approach, and this is something that I've mentioned before. When I say comprehensive, there is a track that we have to look at the denuclearization process, and there are many different areas there, the freezing and verification and all of that. There's that denuclearization process, but to get to the denuclearization process, there needs to be an easing of military threats and regime security. This is what the DPRK has asked for. And that is why together with the denuclearization process, we have the Peninsula peace process and the military tension easing and trust building, including the conventional arms control process. And these have to go in tandem. So a lot of these different tracks should go in tandem for the denuclearization process to also go in the way that we feel is desirable. That is why the Pyongyang Joint Declaration also talked about the September 19th military agreement. And I think that this has been mentioned by other panelists as well, but an economic community for the ROK and DPRK, and also recently the ROK community has been talking about a bio community, a life community of sorts. I think that was the expression used, but there was this concept of creating different communities between the ROK and the DPRK, and lastly would be followed by normalization between US and DPRK, several human rights situation enhancements, improving human rights situation in the DPRK, as mentioned by Ambassador Gallucci. So there are so many of these issues out there, which is why we need a comprehensive look and comprehensive position of all these different issues. What are we going to prioritize? Some may ask. Some might say that if they're values oriented, especially for normalization of ties, we have to look at human rights, first of all. And yes, I do agree that that is such a very important issue. And there are also some who say that we need to ease sanctions to try to allow for economic development and also engage in humanitarian assistance. All of these different issues are so important. However, for now, for the time being, there needs to be some measure of progress made on the denuclearization process for the other processes to follow suit. And the denuclearization process is tied in with the peace regime process or the military tension easing or peace building or trust building process. So we have to be very mindful when we come up with the sequencing of these issues, but we don't want to just overemphasize one issue out of the other. And that could lead to a sort of a stumbling block for us to pursue all of these processes simultaneously. So we have to be very careful in the sequencing, but which is why I think that right now we have to focus on denuclearization and the peace process. And for that, we have to think about military tension easing and trust building, which is why I think that, we have the restrained joint military US-Korea exercises. So beginning with those wheels, then we hope that the wheels will turning the other wheels, economic development and so on and so forth. And I think that the Sentosa Agreement outlays some of this, the denuclearization peace process, dialogue between the DPRK and the ROK, trust building between the US and DPRK. Some of the general ideas have been laid out in the Sentosa document. So I think that the Korean side are aware of that, and we have all of these different ingredients out there that we can use to cook with, and we just want the product to be very delicious and flavorful. And so I think that there are good experienced chefs on both sides, in the ROK side and the US side. So they're probably being, very mindful and thinking hard about the sequencing, like what they should put first. And I think that I would like to think that they're closely coordinating on that issue. And with that in mind, they will enter into dialogue and communications. And because these are very seasoned, very experienced professionals, I think that they would do a good job. And because the Biden administration has just recently launched and they will really, focus on this issue. So hopefully, instead of just waiting for the DPRK to do something first, maybe we can take the first step. Earlier, we talked about pressure and diplomacy, but we will maintain the pressure with the sanctions and etc. But maybe we can focus a little bit more on the diplomatic side. Maybe even take the first step preemptively before the DPRK does something. And that is the signal. I think then with those signals, the ROK and the US can continue to get the ball rolling. I think that the people in charge are very, very good experts. So I'm trying to be hopeful, cautiously optimistic.
We have 12 minutes left. I think I have a lot of questions left, but I wish I have more time, but I think we have to keep the time. So I'll give you 3 questions for final questions. So I'll give you 3 minutes max. You don't have to explain everything, but just short answers. Number 1 is, a lot of people are, advising, Biden administration to accept or to reconfirm the Singapore declarations. That's number 1. What do you think about that? Second is actually Ambassador Carlucci brought up that the role of China. Actually, there was two different approach toward China's role. Number 1 is, Obama period, pressure China to pressure North Korea more. Actually, that didn't work out. And during Trump, actually, they, criticized the China in a way, interfere with this process. Another possible role is right now this, persuade China to persuade North Korea. So the three options that what do you think about that? The final one is best scenario from now until the beginning of next year. Actually, my my best scenario is starting with the Tokyo Olympic, like Pyeongchang, and then they finish up the reviewing process, and in July they meet again, and then the second half that negotiating, and the early next year, which is the 3-year anniversary of Hanoi, then we can repackage and then reach the agreement. What do you think about that? They're starting with the original order. Alex first.
Wait, sorry. The first question was about Singapore's statement. The second question was Tokyo Olympics.
No, China's role. China's role.
And third is Tokyo Olympics.
China, to do something, yeah.
Right.
And
So the first,
scenario,
yeah. On the first, I would emphasize to the Biden team that as they contemplate how to handle the Singapore statement, they have to realize that it's something that we haven't had before, which is a leader-level commitment to denuclearization. I mean, it is Kim Jong-un's signature at the bottom of that document. In very large and dramatic strokes, it is his signature, not that of a foreign minister, not that of an underling. It is his, and he has endorsed that statement internally to his people. So, I would be very careful about how you handle that, because these are Kim Jong-un's words, and I think it has had a very beneficial effect on his conduct because he's signed it. And people say, well, he was always careful not to ruin or affect the relationship with President Trump. I think it was more that he saw the Singapore statement as a success, and he wants to husband that. Number two, on China, I gave a speech at the end of last year about the need for China to live up to its obligations on sanctions that it itself voted for. I still continue to believe that that's the case. But I think there needs to be dialogue on this, continued dialogue between Beijing and the United States to make that clear. I do think China has a role to play here, but it's also not immune to the pressure from around the world to live up to the sanctions in the way that every other nation has lived up to sanctions enforcement. Number three, the Tokyo Olympics. I do think it's an opportunity. As you remember, the Pyeongchang Olympics were kind of an opportunity. That'll have to be continued discussion between Seoul and Tokyo in the United States. But I do see it as a positive event. So hopefully it is.
Hey, Ambassador.
So on the first point about how the Biden administration should treat the Singapore summit, I would completely associate myself with Alex on that. I think that the words are good. I think they are especially good because, as he points out, we have a commitment from the chairman with that document, and and it's not a document. When I've looked at it that need cause us trouble. I mean, what it is a good place to start, and it wouldn't be a bad place to end either. So I'm for preserving Singapore, notwithstanding any feelings one may have about administration's overall foreign policy. Put all that aside. Look at the Singapore deal. Does it help us with North Korea? And for me, the answer is yes. The second question is China. And I was a long time ago in another universe, the instrument that was sent as part of my negotiating with the North to go to Beijing more than once to execute versions of what you suggested, either to scare the Chinese with the intelligence briefings about the North Koreans, which best I could tell they didn't believe, or to pressure them to pressure Pyongyang, which they completely resisted. So my view is that if we have a mature dialogue with Beijing, not name calling, but we in other words, acknowledging that we have many issues to take up with the Chinese, from what they're doing in the South China Sea, the Taiwan issue, trade, it goes on and on. This is an issue in which we really do have some overlapping interests. They have no interest in seeing American military and naval presence increase in Northeast Asia. They have no interest in a conflict on their doorstep on the peninsula. So if we can just sign them up to being supportive. And yes, as long as there are sanctions in place, we recognize the Chinese act.
Oops, he's gone.
Looks like we lost him, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Then, yeah, we can call him again if possible later. Okay. 짧게 해주세요, 두 분. 장관님.
Vice Minister, would you like to take the floor, please?
장관님 먼저 하시죠.
제가 먼저 할까요?
Should I go first? Okay. So going back to the three questions that you posed. So I've talked about nuclear issues, that it is not a sprint. It should be seen as a marathon. It takes a long-term approach. That means there are different athletes and players involved that should be involved in that relay marathon to continue on with the run. Of course, you would have to get that baton off of the previous athlete to continue running. But going back to the Sentosa Agreement, it is very critical, very important. Includes all of the important elements embedded in there. And as was mentioned by other discussants, it is an agreement that was reached at the summit level of the two countries. And of course, it could serve as a very important starting point. But of course, we're talking about the new administration. So whether it is a political consideration, if, for example, there's any room for improvement, and that would have to be worked on by the new administration, something to be worked on by the new administration, which would have to continue with follow-up negotiations. So that would be a big task for the new administration. So of course, the Sentosa Agreement could serve as a very important starting point for negotiations. What about the roles of China? Whether it is pressure or whether it is diplomacy or engagement, the role of China will be very important when it comes to North Korea's nuclear issues as well as other issues on the Korean Peninsula. But many people are very concerned, especially with the launch of the new administration, as well as going back to the previous administration, that there's some conflict and competition between China and the United States, and that factor could actually have a negative impact or effect on the U.S. dealing with DPRK. But of course, there's competition as well as conflicts between the United States and China. That is a reality, and I understand that. But when it comes to nuclear issues and the North Korean issues, I hope that the United States and China could take the path for cooperation. And we really don't want to see any developments in the Korean Peninsula turn for the worse, because that will not be in the interest of the United States and nor the Chinese government as well. So it is very important to induce a constructive role from China. That is something to be done by the United States as well as the South Korean government. It's Dr. Kim. Like you said, what would be the best scenario? And going back to our experience in 2018, well, we don't have to be too bogged down on the Olympic issue, but of course, it could serve as a good starting point or an opportunity. And we really want to have North Korea come out of its wait-and-see attitude, and the Tokyo Olympic could become a very good opportunity. And as I mentioned before, there's a COVID-19 pandemic underway, and of course, depending on the vaccination, this problem will come under control, but we still need some time to put a complete end to the pandemic. There are opportunities for cooperation in terms of humanitarian assistance, and that is a signal that the Unification Ministry is sending to North Korea. It really depends on North Korea. And all of these situations could actually work in favor of North Korea. And with that, there could be a serious dialogue between the two Koreas as well as the United States and the DPRK. And if we can initiate the peace process on the Korean Peninsula in full swing, of course, we could, of course, utilize the second or third anniversary of the Sentosa Agreement as well.
네, 간단하게 해주십시오.
It's Dr. Kim, briefly, please.
네.
So regarding the Singapore declaration, as the other panelists have said, I do agree. The Singapore declaration if Biden administration can send out a signal that they say they will respect the terms of this document, I think that that could be a positive starting point and provide some positive conditions. And as been mentioned before, this is a summit level piece of document. A summit level signed, the leaders have signed it, and for the Biden administration to uphold this declaration would allow the DPRK to ease some of that mistrust that they have against the U.S. administration. So I think that that could be helpful to a large degree. And with the Singapore declaration, if we even look at the substance of the agreement, it is similar to the spirit of the Panmunjom agreement between the ROK and the DPRK. So that is also helpful, that it is upholding an existing spirit, an existing piece of declaration. And so that would also go a long way as well. It could serve as a basic framework of sorts for future negotiations with the DPRK. So hopefully Biden respecting or announcing that they would uphold the terms of the Singapore Declaration could be very helpful in providing some positive conditions and positive terms for future negotiations with the DPRK. Secondly, with China's role, I agree with all the other panelists saying that China's role is obviously very important here. But one of the points that I would also like to make is that with the denuclearization negotiations, they have been led primarily by the US and DPRK, but the denuclearization process and the peace process cannot be separated from each other. So it is ideal for these two processes to go in tandem. And I think that that is something that is in keeping with the Singapore document as well. So in that regard, in coming up with a peace regime, one of the most important things is to have a peace agreement. And if we could go towards signing a peace agreement, this would replace the 1953 armistice agreement, in which case we know that China has been a party to that armistice agreement, so we would have to involve China somehow with the peace agreement. I don't know exactly what point in time, but when we talk about possible peace agreement and sometime in the peace regime process, we would have to include China. China's cooperation is very inevitable, so to speak, and it's a very important part of this denuclearization/peace process. And so in that regard, the Biden administration, I know that they see China as a strategic competitor, but at least when it comes to the denuclearization issue, they would have to be aware of the importance of China in that regard. So that is another point that I just wanted to mention here, along with the other panelists' points. And lastly, on the Tokyo Olympics front, I think that Tokyo Olympics can be a good opportunity because it's such a grand event. But for it to be a workable opportunity, some work has to be done prior to that, leading up to the Olympics, some sort of trust building exercises, maybe send out some sort of message or engage in some kind of trust building actions, some specific actions toward that regard. We need to have that leading up to the Tokyo Olympics if we want to leverage the Tokyo Olympics as an opportunity for dialogue. I think that the US ROK joint combined military exercises are currently underway right now, which might make this situation a little bit challenging. I personally had hoped that the exercises could be postponed a little bit, but in any case, I thought that the postponement could maybe make things a little bit more positive for the DPRK dialogue. Of course, I know that the military exercises have been largely downsized, which I take that to be an encouraging sign, but we still have to try to make use of the situation to do something positive right now leading up to the Tokyo Olympics. And also with this message that the President Biden can send that he would uphold the terms of the Singapore document, maybe that could lead to a good, stepping stone leading up to the Tokyo Olympics becoming a good opportunity for the denuclearization talks with the DPRK. And that, all of these different actions would allow for us to do something with the Tokyo Olympics.
I feel like 1 hour, but we already passed the 2 hours. I think we're wonderful and meaningful discussions. I'm sorry that we lost Ambassador Carlucci at the end. So make sure that tell him that he contributed a lot and we learned a lot, and I learned a lot. And that the Secretary of State, Blinken, said that at his inauguration, actually confirmation hearings that, and Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China, and that he would choose a different methodology while keeping the basic principle intact. So the Biden administration can do the same with North Korea. It is true that the Singapore agreement between the North and the U.S. is incomplete, as it lacks specific details, but it holds value in that it offered a conceptual framework and principles for establishing new U.S.-North Korea relations, building peace regime, and achieving denuclearization. As I said, for coming month, I think it can be a signal game between the two countries. So I think exchange positive signal, not the provocative words, I think is extremely important, and building ground for next coming negotiation, I think. Wendy Sherman used to talk about, is it Susan Rice? I forgot. During the the Perry process, famous word, listen to Seoul, talk to Pyongyang. I think that's the best way to wrap up. Thank you very much, especially Alex from America, and we had a good discussions. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I'll pass my mic to the organizer, Minister of the Unification. Yeah.
So thank you for all the participants. So actually, my deputy minister, he's holding some discussion with my minister. So I'm sorry to deliver through his absence of this session. So thank you again, all participants.